Winter, 1842. High in the mountains of Afghanistan, an entire army was trying to escape. 16,000 people were marching through narrow, frozen passes. British soldiers, Indian sepoys, women, children, camp followers, all retreating from Kabul toward safety in India. Snow covered the ground. Afghan fighters watched from the cliffs above. 7 days later, almost every single one of them was dead. One survivor reached the British outpost at Jalalabad. Just one. The question that stunned the British Empire was simple. How could this happen? How could a modern imperial army collapse so completely in the mountains of Afghanistan? How could one retreat turn into one of the most devastating disasters in British military history? At the center of this catastrophe stood a young Afghan prince named Akbar Khan. He was the son of the powerful ruler Dost Mohammad Khan. To the British, he was a dangerous rebel. To many Afghans, he became a symbol of resistance against foreign occupation. Akbar Khan did not command vast modern armies. He did not control a global empire. But in the winter of 1842, through strategy, alliances, and relentless pressure in the mountains, he helped bring an imperial force to its knees. What followed shocked London, reshaped British policy in Central Asia, and became one of the most haunting episodes of the First Anglo-Afghan War. But the road to that frozen retreat began years earlier, with fear, political miscalculation, and a dangerous imperial rivalry known as the Great Game. To understand how 16,000 people walked into the mountains of Afghanistan and almost none came out, we have to go back to the beginning.
In the early 19th century, Afghanistan sat at the crossroads of empires. Mountain ranges cut across the country like natural fortresses, while ancient trade routes linked Persia, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. For centuries, armies had marched through these passes, but few had ever managed to control the region for long. By the 1830s, the most powerful empire in the region was the British Empire in India. From its administrative center in Calcutta, the British East India Company governed tens of millions of people and commanded one of the largest standing armies in the world. Yet British officials were increasingly anxious about a threat that seemed distant but potentially catastrophic. That threat came from the north. The Russian Empire was expanding steadily across Central Asia. Russian diplomats and explorers were appearing in cities like Bukhara and Khiva, and British strategists feared that one day Russian influence might reach Afghanistan. If Russia gained a foothold there, the mountain passes leading toward India could become corridors for invasion. This strategic rivalry between Britain and Russia became known as the Great Game. It was not a formal war, but a long contest of influence, espionage, diplomacy, and political manipulation across Central Asia. Afghanistan, sitting between the two empires, became one of its most important battlegrounds. At the time, Afghanistan itself was politically fragmented. The most powerful leader in the region was Dost Mohammad Khan, a member of the Barakzai dynasty, who had taken control of Kabul in 1826. He was an experienced and pragmatic ruler who spent much of his reign trying to balance rival powers while keeping the country unified. Dost Muhammad's greatest challenge came from the Sikh Empire to the east. Under the rule of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the Sikhs had seized the city of Peshawar, which Dost Muhammad considered a vital Afghan territory. The Afghan ruler desperately wanted British help to recover it. In 1837, Dost Muhammad sent diplomatic signals to the British, hoping to form an alliance. But British officials in India were hesitant. They did not want to confront the powerful Sikh Empire, which at the time was an important partner along India's northwest frontier. Meanwhile, Russian agents were also making contact with Kabul. One of them, Captain Ivan Vitkevich, arrived as an envoy, seeking to establish relations with Dost Mohammad. Although Russian intentions were limited and somewhat uncertain, the mere presence of a Russian diplomat in Kabul triggered alarm in British policymakers. In London and Calcutta, the situation was interpreted as a dangerous shift in the balance of power. British officials feared that if Afghanistan drifted toward Russian influence, the entire northern frontier of British India could become unstable. The Governor-General of India at the time was Lord Auckland. Faced with growing anxiety about Russian expansion, he made a decision that would have enormous consequences. Instead of supporting Dost Mohammad, who was already ruling in Kabul, the British decided to remove him from power. Their plan was to reinstall a former Afghan ruler named Shah Shuja Durrani. Shah Shuja had once ruled Afghanistan decades earlier, but had been overthrown and forced into exile. For years, he had lived under British protection in India, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim his throne. To British strategists, Shah Shuja seemed like the perfect solution. He was willing to cooperate with British interests, and they believed that with military support, he could rule Afghanistan as a friendly monarch. What they underestimated was how unpopular he had become among many Afghans. In 1839, British and Indian forces began one of the most ambitious military campaigns in the region's history. An army of around 20,000 troops marched northwest through the harsh terrain of southern Afghanistan. The force included British regiments, Indian sepoys, artillery, and large supply caravans that stretched for miles. After a difficult march across deserts and mountain passes, the British Army reached the fortress city of Ghazni. In July 1839, they captured it in a dramatic assault that shocked Afghan defenders. Soon after, the road to Kabul lay open. Dost Mohammad Khan was forced to flee, and Shah Shuja was installed on the throne under British protection. At first, the campaign appeared to be a stunning success. British officers in Kabul wrote confident reports back to India, describing the operation as a decisive victory. But beneath the surface, the situation was much more fragile than it seemed. Afghanistan was not a country that could easily be ruled by a foreign-backed monarch. Tribal loyalties were complex, local leaders valued independence, and many Afghans deeply resented the presence of foreign troops in their capital. The British Army, believing the war was effectively over, settled into cantonments outside Kabul rather than occupying the ancient fortress. These cantonments were comfortable but dangerously exposed. They sat in a wide valley, overlooked by hills, and separated from the main defensive strongholds of Kabul. British officers and their families began living relatively relaxed lives, convinced that Afghanistan had been stabilized. Yet resentment was quietly building across the region. Taxes imposed by Shah Shuja angered tribal leaders. Subsidies that the British had been paying to local chiefs were reduced. Afghan fighters who had once supported Dost Mohammad remained hostile to the new regime. What British officials interpreted as calm was often only temporary silence. Among those watching events closely was Dost Mohammad's son, Akbar Khan. Unlike many Afghan leaders of the time, Akbar Khan was young, ambitious, and deeply determined to restore his father's rule. He understood the weaknesses of the British position in Kabul and recognized the growing anger among Afghan tribes. By 1841, that anger was close to boiling over. What the British believed was a secure occupation was in reality an unstable political experiment surrounded by hostile territory. Within months, Kabul would erupt into rebellion. The British garrison would find itself trapped inside Afghanistan's mountains.
and Akbar Khan would emerge as the central figure in a crisis that would soon spiral into one of the most devastating retreats in the history of the British Empire.
By 1841, the British believed their Afghan project was stable. Shah Shuja sat on the throne in Kabul, guarded by British and Indian troops, while political officers reported that order had been restored. Yet the appearance of calm masked a deep and growing resentment that spread quietly across the country. The British garrison in Kabul numbered only a few thousand soldiers. Most were stationed in open cantonments outside the city, rather than inside the old Bala Hisar fortress. The location was comfortable, but militarily weak, surrounded by hills that overlooked the camp from every direction. British officers believed large-scale fighting was unlikely. Many had brought their families, and the cantonments slowly began to resemble a colonial town rather than a military outpost. Dinners, social visits, and routine administration filled the daily schedule. But the political foundations of the occupation were crumbling. Shah Shuja struggled to gain legitimacy among Afghan tribes. His authority depended almost entirely on British support, and many local leaders viewed him as a puppet ruler. At the same time, the British East India Company began cutting the subsidies that had been paid to tribal chiefs to keep the mountain passes peaceful. Those payments had quietly held together a fragile alliance. When they were reduced, resentment quickly resurfaced. Tribes that had tolerated the British presence now saw little reason to continue cooperating. Economic pressure made the situation even worse. Food prices in Kabul rose sharply as British troops and camp followers consumed local supplies. For many Afghans, the occupation began to feel both political humiliation and economic hardship. Meanwhile, the son of the exiled Afghan ruler was watching closely. Akbar Khan, the son of Dost Mohammad Khan, had spent months building connections with tribal leaders who were dissatisfied with the British-backed government. Unlike his father, who had often pursued cautious diplomacy, Akbar Khan embraced a far more aggressive strategy. He understood something the British command did not. Afghanistan's mountains, tribes, and narrow passes could become powerful weapons against a foreign army that depended on long supply lines and fragile alliances. By the autumn of 1841, Kabul was becoming increasingly tense. Small incidents began to multiply across the city and surrounding villages. Rumors spread that tribal fighters were gathering beyond the capital. British officers noticed the unease but underestimated its seriousness. On November 2, 1841, the crisis finally erupted. A mob in Kabul attacked the residence of Sir Alexander Burnes, one of the most experienced British political officers in Afghanistan. Burnes had lived in the city for years and believed he had strong relationships with local leaders. That confidence proved fatal. The crowd surrounding his house quickly grew into a violent uprising. Burnes and his brother attempted to calm the mob, but the situation spiraled out of control. Both men were killed, and their residence was looted and burned. The murder of such a prominent British official sent shockwaves through the cantonments, yet the British military response was hesitant and disorganized. Instead of immediately crushing the rebellion inside Kabul, commanders hesitated, unsure of the scale of the uprising. That hesitation allowed the revolt to spread. Within days, tribal fighters and city rebels began attacking British supply posts and communication routes. Afghan forces captured key positions around Kabul, including hills that overlooked the cantonments. Each new loss made the British position more dangerous. It was during this chaotic moment that Akbar Khan returned to Kabul. His arrival gave the rebellion a central leader.
Young, energetic, and determined to restore his father's rule, Akbar Khan quickly positioned himself as the commander of the Afghan resistance. Tribal fighters who had been acting independently now began coordinating their efforts under his influence. Akbar Khan understood the strategic advantage he possessed. Afghanistan's mountains, tribes, and narrow passes could become powerful weapons against a foreign army that depended on long supply lines and fragile alliances. In direct contrast, British commands seemed to pursue a strategy of inaction. Leaders such as William MacNaughton often seemed more interested in negotiation than decisive military action. Akbar Khan used these talks to weave together a complex web. On one hand, he assured the British of safe passage if they withdrew from their sieged camps. On the other, he continued to strengthen his military position. Unable to secure a reliable deal with the British, Akbar Khan now faced a growing dilemma. His control over the various Afghan factions was tenuous, and he found himself unable to fully fulfill his promises. Afghan fighters continued to attack the British positions. Their strategy was to starve them out and force them to surrender under his terms. This formidable strategy apparently left senior British officials with no choice but to escape Kabul. In desperation, the British commanders agreed to negotiate an evacuation. In December 1841, a formal agreement was signed. The British would leave Kabul for Jalalabad, and Afghan leaders promised a safe passage. In return, the British agreed to surrender part of their artillery, supplies, and hand over hostages as guarantees of good faith. On January 6, 1842, the evacuation began. The column leaving Kabul was enormous and vulnerable. Around 4,500 soldiers marched alongside roughly 12,000 civilians, including families, servants, and camp followers. Wagons, animals, and supply carts stretched across the snowy valley. Their destination was Jalalabad, about 90 miles away. But the road between Kabul and Jalalabad ran through some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. Narrow passes twisted between steep cliffs, and deep winter snow slowed every step of the retreat. Almost immediately, the situation began to deteriorate. Afghan fighters appeared along the ridges above the column. At first, the attacks were scattered, but as the days passed, they grew more frequent and more deadly. Marksmen fired from the rocks, while the long column struggled through narrow passes and frozen valleys. The retreat that had been promised as a safe withdrawal was turning into something far more dangerous. Akbar Khan continued meeting with British officers during the early stages of the march, insisting that he was trying to control the tribal fighters attacking the column. Historians still debate how much control he truly had over the various Afghan groups involved. What is clear is that the attacks never stopped. Each day, the column moved deeper into the mountains, suffering new losses. Cold, hunger, and exhaustion began claiming as many lives as Afghan gunfire. The retreating army was slowly being worn down in one of the harshest environments imaginable. And the worst part of the journey still lay ahead, in the narrow mountain corridor known as the Kurd-Kabul Pass.
By the time the retreating column approached the Kurd-Kabul Pass, the situation had become desperate. Snow covered the ground, freezing winds cut through the narrow valleys, and thousands of exhausted soldiers and civilians struggled to keep moving. The once organized retreat had dissolved into a slow, chaotic mass of people trying to survive another day in the mountains. The Kurd-Kabul Pass was one of the most dangerous sections of the route to Jalalabad. The path narrowed between steep cliffs where attackers could easily fire down on anyone below.
For Afghan fighters familiar with the terrain, it was an ideal place to strike. As the British column entered the pass, the attacks intensified. Marksmen appeared along the ridges and rocky slopes, firing into the tightly packed soldiers and civilians below. Afghan fighters also rushed down from the heights in sudden assaults, targeting stragglers and isolated groups. Every moment spent in the pass exposed the column to deadly fire from above. The retreating force had already lost many of its supplies and artillery pieces. Ammunition was limited, and organized defensive formations became increasingly difficult to maintain. Many soldiers were exhausted, frostbitten, and barely able to march through the deep snow. Akbar Khan remained involved in the unfolding disaster. During the retreat, he met several times with British officers, including General Elphinstone, continuing to negotiate while the attacks continued around them. In one of these meetings, he demanded additional hostages, including senior officers and members of the British political staff. Believing it might protect the remaining column, British leaders agreed. Several prominent figures, including Lady Sale and other civilians, were handed over to hostages to Akbar Khan's forces. They would later survive the conflict, but at the time, the decision revealed how desperate the British position had become. The army that had once conquered Kabul was now bargaining for survival. Despite these negotiations, the violence along the retreat route did not stop. As the column pushed deeper through the mountains, discipline collapsed. Units became separated, and civilians crowded around the remaining soldiers for protection. Afghan fighters continued to strike from the hills, often disappearing before British troops could respond. The worst moment came in the narrow defile of the Kabul Pass itself. Thousands of people were forced into a constricted path, surrounded by high ground controlled by Afghan marksmen. Gunfire poured into the column from both sides. Panic spread rapidly as men, women, and children struggled to escape the killing zone. Many soldiers attempted to fight back, but the terrain made organized defense nearly impossible. The steep slopes allowed Afghan fighters to move quickly between positions while remaining difficult targets. The British column was exposed, exhausted, and increasingly overwhelmed. After the pass, only a fraction of the original force remained. The survivors pushed onward toward the next mountain corridor, the Jogdalak Pass. Here, again, Afghan fighters waited along the heights. Attacks continued day after day, reducing the column further as cold, hunger, and gunfire took their toll. Some small groups attempted to break away and ride ahead toward Jalalabad. Others fell behind in the snow and were captured or killed. By this point, the retreat had ceased to resemble an army movement at all. It had become a desperate flight for survival. In the final stages, near Gandamak, the last organized group of British soldiers made a stand. Surrounded by Afghan fighters and nearly out of ammunition, the remaining troops attempted to resist. Most were killed in the fighting, ending the last significant resistance of the retreating force. The scale of the disaster was staggering. Of roughly 16,000 soldiers and civilians who had left Kabul only days earlier, almost all had been killed, captured, or scattered in the mountains. The once powerful column had been destroyed along the narrow passes between Kabul and Jalalabad. Only one single exhausted survivor managed to reach the safety of the British garrison at Jalalabad. On January 13, 1942, Dr. William Brydon rode through the gates of the fortress, badly wounded and barely alive. When the defenders saw him approaching alone on his horse, they reportedly asked where the rest of the army was. Brydon's answer captured the scale of the catastrophe. "I am the army." News of the disaster soon spread across British India and eventually reached London. an entire retreating force had vanished in the mountains of Afghanistan within the span of a single week. At the center of this extraordinary defeat was the uprising that had begun in Kabul and the resistance led by Akbar Khan, the Afghan prince who had turned the mountains, tribes, and winter itself into powerful weapons against an imperial army. When news of the catastrophe reached British India, the reaction was immediate and intense. The destruction of an entire retreating force shocked the military and political leadership of the East India Company. For an empire accustomed to victories across Asia, the loss of nearly 16,000 soldiers and civilians in the mountains of Afghanistan was almost unimaginable. The British government could not simply ignore such a disaster. In the months that followed, a new military effort was organized to restore British prestige and recover prisoners taken during the retreat. Several columns advanced toward Afghanistan in what became known as the Army of Retribution. These forces pushed back through the same harsh terrain that had destroyed the earlier column. British troops fought their way toward Kabul, determined to demonstrate that the empire could still project power in the region. By late 1842, British forces briefly reoccupied the Afghan capital. During this campaign, several prisoners from the retreat, including British officers and civilians who had been taken as hostages by Akbar Khan's forces, were eventually released. Many had survived months in captivity under difficult conditions. Their return became an important symbol for British authorities seeking to repair morale after the earlier disaster. Despite this show of force, the British leadership had already reached a crucial conclusion. Holding Afghanistan directly was far more difficult and costly than they had expected. The political project that had placed Shah Shuja on the throne had collapsed completely. Shah Shuja himself had been assassinated earlier in 1842 during the chaos following the uprising. Without strong local support and without a permanent British military presence, his rule had quickly fallen apart. The experiment of installing a foreign-backed monarch in Kabul had failed. Rather than attempt another occupation, British authorities chose a different path. After destroying parts of Kabul's main bazaar as a symbolic act of retaliation, the British Army withdrew from the city and marched back toward India. Afghanistan would no longer be directly occupied. In a striking turn of events, the British eventually allowed Dost Mohammad to return from exile and resume power in Kabul. The very ruler they had overthrown a few years earlier was now seen as the most stable option for governing Afghanistan. From the British perspective, a strong but independent Afghan ruler was preferable to the chaos that had followed their intervention. Akbar Khan, whose leadership helped coordinate the resistance against the British occupation, became a celebrated figure among many Afghans. His role during the uprising and the retreat cemented his reputation as a determined defender of Afghan independence. However, his life after the war was relatively short. Akbar Khan died in 1845 at about 28. Although his political career was brief, the events of the First Anglo-Afghan War had already ensured his place in the region's historical memory. For the British Empire, the disaster of the Kabul retreat left a deep and lasting mark. It exposed the limits of imperial power in the difficult terrain and complex politics of Afghanistan. The episode became one of the most infamous military failures in British colonial history. In the decades that followed, British policy toward Afghanistan became far more cautious. The region was still considered strategically important in the rivalry with Russia, but direct occupation was now seen as extremely risky. Afghanistan instead became a buffer state between the British Empire in India and the expanding Russian influence to the north. The memory of the retreat also entered British culture and historical writing. Paintings, memoirs, and military studies often returned to the haunting image of a lone survivor reaching Jalalabad after the destruction of the army. The story became a warning about the dangers of underestimating both geography and local resistance. For Afghanistan, the events reinforced a powerful narrative of resistance against foreign intervention. The mountains, tribal alliances, and fierce determination of local fighters had defeated one of the most powerful empires of the 19th century. More than a century later, historians would still look back on the retreat from Kabul as one of the clearest examples of how difficult Afghanistan has been for outside powers to control. The story of Akbar Khan and the destruction of the retreating column became part of a longer pattern in the country's history. It showed that even a global empire could be vulnerable when fighting in unfamiliar terrain against opponents who understood both the land and the politics of their own country. And it demonstrated how quickly an occupation that seemed secure could collapse when local resistance gathered strength.
The destruction of the British retreat from Kabul in 1842 remains one of the most striking moments in 19th century imperial history. A powerful army entered Afghanistan with confidence, installed a new ruler, and believed the situation was under control. Within only a few years, that same force was forced to flee through the mountains, where nearly the entire column disappeared in the snow and gunfire of the Afghan passes. At the center of that turning point was Akbar Khan, a young Afghan prince who recognized the weaknesses of a foreign occupation in a fiercely independent land. He did not command an empire or a massive standing army, yet he understood the power of terrain, alliances, and timing. In the mountains surrounding Kabul, those advantages proved stronger than imperial confidence. The story also raises a larger question that historians continue to debate. How often have powerful empires believed they could reshape Afghanistan, only to discover that its politics, geography, and local loyalties were far more complex than they expected? The events of 1842 became an early example of how difficult it is for outside powers to control the region for long. More than a century and a half later, the retreat from Kabul is still remembered as a warning about ambition, miscalculation, and the limits of military power. It reminds us that even the strongest armies can be vulnerable when they misunderstand the land and the people they are trying to rule. If you found this story fascinating, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe the British defeat was inevitable once they occupied Afghanistan, or could different decisions have changed the outcome? And if you enjoyed deep historical stories like this one, make sure to subscribe for more episodes exploring the moments that shaped our world.